Hi, I'm Jim Bergeron, pastor at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas. This is a sermon for the 11th Sunday after Pentecost in the A series. The lyrics of a song by Tom Waits, urban street poet, go like this. Things are tough all over when the thunderstorms start increasing over the southeast and south central portions of my apartment. I get upset and a line of thunderstorms was developing in the early morning. The tornado watches issued for the areas including the western region of my mental health and the northern portion of my ability to deal rationally with my disconcerted, precarious emotional situation. Flash flood watches covered the southern portion of my disposition. On the White Hawks at the Diner album, that's the song Emotional Weather Report. Bad weather is part of life. Sometimes even heavy emotional weather, like regular heavy atmospheric weather. It can be distracting, fascinating, fearful, dangerous. Plus, the adrenaline in your blood will help you with your large fight or flight muscles. Midwestern farmers enjoy the weather, even watching for tornadoes. We'd sit in our vehicles on the sandy section line roads in the middle of Kansas, watching to the southwest for the clouds with circulation that might drop a funnel onto the prairie. The narrow roads were lined with hedge apple trees, often called Osage oranges or bodarks, planted as windbreaks and snow fences for the fields. We didn't chase tornadoes. When we saw one, we knew which direction to run. One day a friend was justified in his storm observation. A cloud dropped on the road about a mile away from him, coming straight east toward him. He took off west, looking for the next best southbound turnoff, running about 65 on a road good for 35. The storm would be angling northeast in its path. He kept checking the rearview mirror. He figured maybe the devil was chasing him, because behind him trees were folding in on the road from both sides and then crazily floating up into the spinning black maw of the storm. He outran it. He had a great story to tell. Last week we explored the political storms of Jesus' day, the storms of a hoped-for revolution brewing on the near horizon. Today's narrative takes us from that site of the famous feeding of a multitude across the Galilee into a storm. Jesus sends the disciples out to sea. He dismisses the crowd, who are probably still intent somehow, somewhere on revolting against Rome. Those miracles of both healing and feeding would seem to many like Jesus is the one who will lead a successful revolution. They would carry him as their king into triumph in Jerusalem at the time of Passover. The crowd wants to force God's hand. Somehow, Jesus manages to get the disciples packed up in the boat and headed out for unfamiliar territory. The crowd dismissed so he can take some time to pray. And once again, he's in the wilderness with the tempter, Jesus' own personal in-between storm. And then, in that in-between time, the in-between storm breaks loose on the disciples' little boat. Matthew, not even subtly, lifts up the disciples and the early church as a boat beset by a storm. Matthew says their boat was tortured and tormented, even as was their small but growing group that followed in Jesus' way, tortured and tormented by both religious and political adversaries. The disciples embarked at dusk. They're still rowing and bailing desperately in the wee hours of the morning. They're exhausted and hungry. They're freezing, afraid of dying. The chaos is overwhelming and all hope is lost. In the summer of 70, I suffered through an in-between storm. It was the first event. in between the transition from the civilized comforts of home during a summer session to the raw, unforgiving wilderness of the Wind River mountain range in Wyoming. 6 weeks of primitive survival started with canoeing white water on the Green River. The attitude of the guides was sink or swim. After this test, there would be no quitting, no evacuations. If you break a leg, tough. You make a splint and a crutch and you walk back out. The guides said, meet us downriver in 4 hours. They assigned buddies and we launched. My buddy had never been in a boat. A total city kid, spoiled and not smart enough to even be a nerd, I kept yelling at him, just sit still and quit rowing. Every time he put his oar in the water, the canoe would turn around and spin backwards down the swift current. Everybody else left us in their wake. We were all alone. At the first set of rapids, we got sideways on a boulder in the middle of the river. The water pouring into the canoe wedged it around a rock. I dragged the buddy by his life jacket in freezing, pounding water to get into the shore. Miraculously, an angel on horseback was there watching. Looked like a grizzled old cowboy to me. He was an Arapaho from the reservation we were traveling through. Technically, we were in a different nation, there only by permission of the tribal authority and watched carefully by trackers. I waded out to the wrecked canoe with the scout's rope, and he and his horse pulled it off the rock and dragged it to shore. My buddy was headed toward hypothermia. All but sunk by this storm of white water, we now entered the storm of almost freezing to death on a sunny day at high altitude, surrounded by snowmelt water. My buddy was stunned by his fear and quaking, but at least he was too exhausted to row, so he just curled up and cried. I rowed like my life depended on it, because I'm pretty sure it did. I didn't want to wash out of survival school before it even started, abandoned in the wilderness. This wasn't a vacation. Doesn't matter who we are, what we do, we face storms when we least expect them, in the in-between times. Jesus sends his disciples out into the in-between. They're traversing from familiar territory to a strange place, from the known to the unknown, from the Jewish side of the lake to the Gentile side. What's familiar is behind them. The future shores are awaiting their arrival. In the meantime, the in-between is frightening and exhausting, and they see the new shore with trepidation and fear. Could be an opportunity, though. In God's loving grace, we're sent into mission by Jesus. He's always there with us. One point is, don't let circumstances distract you from God. The storm doesn't have to be overwhelming. Sooner or later, it will be over. Even when profoundly disturbing, it's temporary, just weather. The next time a storm hits you, ask yourself, does this change your relationship with God? We don't worship the storm. We observe it carefully, monitor its direction, and respond appropriately. Perhaps that observation would take a little wind out of the sails of those who bemoan the state of the church and have for 5 decades. The analysts and pollsters keep saying that the church is in trouble. Attendance is down. The faithful are fearful. It's good to listen and consider their insights. But in another sense, we might respond by noting, the church is in trouble? So, what else is new? The church, when it's working in mission, is always in trouble. You don't get flack unless you're over the target. It's a little boat, this grand institution, when compared to the vast sea of chaos and storms that we seek to sail. Sometimes we row against each other and even wreck the boat or curl up in the hull, quivering helplessly in the cold. The great unbelievable news is that Jesus is coming across the chaos to us. One of his names, Emmanuel, means God with us. The disciples cry out in fear. Jesus says, "It is I. I am who I am, Yahweh." Exactly God's answer when Moses asks his name. In between all that is happening in the surging chaos of the storm, God's there. We won't sink. I grew up with animals. My first word was kitty. Much to the chagrin of my mother, she should have been proud it was imitation. One of her practices every day when feeding the cats was to go out the kitchen door and yell, "Kitty, kitty, kitty, kitty." Singer, a long-haired blonde cat, slept with me from the time I came home from my birth at the hospital. He was 10 years old then. I laid beside him under the dining room table as he died. I was 10 years old then. He was an old cat. Mom got me a new cat. I named her Tinkerbell. She was so little and light-footed that she could tiptoe down piano keys without making a sound. However, she was not allowed on the piano. Whenever she was caught there, she faced some stormy hollering, and she'd take off running down the keyboard, making odd music. We called it the cat panic arpeggio. It must be that a scared cat is heavier. Maybe that's why Peter sang. He panicked, got scared, and, well, his name did mean rock. And the longest I've ever seen a rock walk on water is about 7 skips. That's a flat rock thrown by a good sidearm pitcher on a perfectly glassy lake. I can imagine Thomas back in the boat shouting out to Peter, "Hey, look out, Rocky, here comes a big wave." Storms by their nature command attention. Just don't let circumstances around you distract you from God. The in-between time from the port you have left and the port you're headed to may be stormy, but not that overwhelming if you stay in the boat, stay focused on the mission, and let God come to your consciousness and live awareness. Cosmic safety over chaos. For 20 years, a monk studied under a master. Every morning he went out for his morning meditation and came back for lunch soaking wet. His master never asked, but he always kind of wondered why. Finally, one day, the monk comes back. He's dry. He's celebrating with joy. He excitedly recounts 20 years of trying to walk on water as a spiritual discipline. And finally, this day, he did it without sinking. The master thought about it and said, "You know, for $1, you could have taken the ferry and brought some bread to the hungry people on the other side." Despite his sinking, Peter's a cool guy. He has a mad faith. Anyone in their right mind wouldn't even think of walking on water, much less in a battering storm. He dreamed of doing the impossible. At least he dared, in the presence of Christ, to undertake what others feared and would even consider. Regardless of the storm, Peter leaped before he looked so that he could participate in a miraculous walk with the Lord. This, above all, is a beautiful failure story. Even in our churchy language, we talk of coming to Jesus as if our willpower and strong faith can pull that little trick off. With deep compassion, Jesus honors our efforts with the understanding that when we fail, when we sink, when the storm destroys us, Jesus is immediately by our side, catching us. He comes to us, not the other way around. Peter failed in what he wanted to do the most, but succeeded mightily in being saved. God's walking around in our storms also, risking, walking, sinking, and knowing the salvation relief of Jesus bringing us back up. It's the joy of living in faith. No need to panic. No need to let the storm put the vice grips on your mental health. God enjoys weather, and we're never alone if we can enjoy strolling with Him and seeking His help in the risky weather of life. When Peter realizes he's in trouble, he prays, and it's not the prayer of pious and long-winded preachers. Peter's prayer is short and concise. 3 words, Lord, save me. When we're doing our business in deep water, all we need to pray for is help. It's not about walking on water. It's about getting back in the boat, staying in mission, and hanging out with Jesus in the in-between storm. Amen.